Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. Take a seat. I've got my emergency glasses here just in case I can't see it, but my ego means that I will try and not use them for as much as I can. We'll see how we go. As we approach Easter, there's a whole lot of language that we use to describe Easter and what it's all about and what it means to us and what the significance of the cross is. And one of the most important words that we hear used through our description of Jesus and the crucifixion and what he brings in salvation is his light. And Jesus is the light and life. We hear this word light over and over and over again as it is used to describe the impact that Jesus has on the world. In John 8, verse 12, Jesus spoke to the people once more and said, "I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness because you will have the light that leads to life." And this is this idea that Jesus came into a dark world and he brought his mere presence, brought light into that, and that then lifts us out of the darkness is such a pervasive part of who we understand Jesus to be and how we understand how we relate to him. And it's not just something Jesus said, it goes all the way back to the prophecies that were put in place about Jesus coming. David says this in Psalm 25, verse 7. "Do not remember the rebellious sins of my youth. Remember me in the light of your unfailing love, for you are merciful, O Lord." So once again, we see light being connected with mercy and connected to relationship with God. Psalm 27, verse 1. "The Lord is my light and my salvation, so why should I be afraid? The Lord is my fortress, protecting me from danger, so why should I tremble?" Light, again, is being used here to demonstrate the strength that comes from that relationship with God. It's a powerful, powerful image because we all understand the significance of light. For those of you who were here last week, when the lights go off on the stage and it's dark, everyone notices very, very quickly. And then you notice someone running up the back to try and work it all out. But that idea of light in darkness is something that gives us joy. And if you think about the fears that humans have had over thousands and thousands of years, one of the most significant one is darkness. The desire to create fire so that there could be light, the desire to bring light into houses, desire to bring closeness by having light around us is something that's intrinsic to all of us. We all have that understanding of how light actually influences and impacts our lives. But one of the challenges of the way we talk about it is that we speak about it in a very binary way. We speak about it in a very simple way, which is the light is either on or it's off. It's either there or it's not there. We either have light or darkness. It's two very simple things that we think about, and we just look at one or the other. And we actually see that binary engagement with lightness and darkness actually filters through how we communicate, even in the church, and how the church has communicated over hundreds of years. Someone is either a sinner or a saint. They're either good or bad. They're either a failure or a success. We use these categories, these binary categories, very, very easily because it comes from this idea of lightness and darkness. We fall into that trap of religiosity that says there's two types of people. There's good people and there's bad people. And as soon as we fall into that world, we've actually missed the fundamental characteristic of Christ, which is the grace that comes through his salvation. Light is a powerful metaphor for understanding who Jesus is. But if we don't understand the metaphor properly, we actually miss something really, really significant. Because Jesus bringing forth his grace gives us a different understanding of who we are and who we are in his image. So that's the introduction. Now we're going to skip around a little bit. Just on 4 years ago, the world went into lockdown for COVID. And all around the world, people were talking about what they were going to do during lockdown. Now, we didn't, in Alice Springs, have lockdown quite as bad as other people did. We had, those people may remember, we had army out on roads. We could drive around Alice, but we couldn't get out. But there were people in Italy and New York and US and around the world who were locked down and not able to do things. We saw videos on YouTube of people in Italy hanging out their balconies all singing together and people writing poetry, and everyone was going to make sourdough. And so many people I know were going to make sourdough, and everyone was going to learn a language. Do you know, Duolingo, does anyone know what Duolingo is? It's an app on your phone. Hands up if you use it. You are all part of a cult and you should stop doing it now. And I include my wife in that, and 2 of the kids who aren't here. So there are, as a result of COVID, Duolingo in the US now teaches more people foreign languages than the entire American school system does. That's how pervasive it was. So everyone goes into COVID, they go into lockdown, and they all have grand ambitions about what they are going to do and achieve. I didn't achieve any of those things. My language skills are about as constrained as they were previously. I'm still reasonably good at German conjunctions. Backpfeifen steht, which is a German conjunction that describes someone whose face deserves to be slapped. That's about as far as I got with my embracing of foreign languages. I did cook a lot more, but the kids fairly quickly found out that my range of recipes was probably not as broad as they had hoped, so we had to expand those out a bit. But I didn't take full advantage of the lockdown to yield some great creative element of my spirit that should otherwise have been released. And I feel bad about that. But I have moved through, because the reality is very few of us ever achieve what it is that we set out to achieve when we have these grand ambitions about what we're going to do in a break. However, there is someone who, having the disease rolling around the world and having to be sent home from university, went into lockdown and did something quite remarkable. Now, this young individual was about 24 years old. He was at Cambridge University, a full scholarship, and he got sent home and was in lockdown, but he was locked down for quite a long time. But it was actually about 400 years ago. And this gentleman is Sir Isaac Newton. So we'll bring his... Now, I mean, I wish I had hair like that. Isn't that just like flowing locks? Although if it was in Australia today, I'm sure it would be sort of some gorgeous mullet just hanging on there. So Isaac Newton went into lockdown. So they got all sent home from Cambridge University because bubonic plague was sweeping through Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying very, very quickly. So he got sent home, so goes to his mum's place, and he's there for a long time. Now, while we were all thinking about whether we should learn a language or like create sourdough, so Isaac Newton invented a large chunk of mathematics. So this formula here is the fundamental formula for differential calculus. Completely meaningless to most of you. I did a lot of subjects about it at one point, not very well. I had to do many of the same subjects over and over because I wasn't particularly good about it, which is still a bone of contention for my mother, who actually tutors in this and was appalled by the fact that I kept failing the very subject that she should be good at teaching me about. But of course, I didn't take a lot of attention from what she was sharing with me. But he went home and sat at his mother's house, and he designed the mathematics that largely underpin all of our systems and engineering and sciences today. Not a bad effort if you're in lockdown by yourself. So any of you who only made one loaf of sourdough, you're ashamed because Sir Isaac Newton beat you. But as a consequence of this, he went on to establish another book, which is this. So he published this in 1686, Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica. It's Latin for I created maths. And he created and wrote down all of these equations and started to think about how the world was constructed and why did things happen the way it did. Now, at around about this same time, the Catholic Church had been sponsoring scientific research with Copernicus and Galileo. There's a lot of assumptions that the church was actually anti-science at that period of time, but the research and the history actually shows that the church was very often funding the scientific research. And so there was a lot of work going on, realising that we were no longer in the idea of an Earth-centric world. We were actually in a heliocentric universe where we travelled around the sun, and that was challenging people's ideas of how things worked. And we were starting to understand that the moon was influencing the world and it was influencing tides, and there'd been many thousands of years of observations looking at what was going on and trying to record how the movement of the planets impacted things on the Earth. And Isaac Newton, along with a few others, it wasn't just him, but he was probably one of the leading lights at this point in time, started to put in place, as a result of these mathematics, a set of rules to describe how things worked in the world. And these three rules are called Newton's third laws, or the Newton's three laws, the fundamental laws of classical mechanics. You had no idea that this was coming down the train at you today, and it only gets better from where this goes. So just hold on to your hats, and you should be taking notes. So he invented differential calculus, but he then spent a lot of time thinking, well, what do I do with that, and how do I use it to describe the world around me? And so he created three fundamental rules of physics that actually describe how the world works. The first one is this: a body remains at rest or in motion at a constant speed in a straight line, except insofar as it is exacted upon by a force. Just all riveted by this. Basically, it means that if I start walking that way until I either get tired or run out of puff, I'll keep going that way unless someone comes and crash tackles me from the side. If I throw a ball, it'll go in a straight line unless something else exerts on it. Whatever body is moving, it'll continue moving in that direction until something else acts upon it. That's the basic idea of the first law of motion. The second law of motion: the net force on a body is equal to the body's instantaneous acceleration multiplied by its instantaneous mass, or equivalently, the rate at which the body's momentum changes with time. Oh, so exciting. Force equals mass times acceleration. Basically, that's what he's saying. If you want to know what the force is of something, you take out how much does it weigh and how much is it moving, or how fast it's accelerating, and that's the force that you have upon it. If you want to know really simply what that means, is if you're in a 2-ton car and you're driving at 20 kilometres an hour into a brick wall, it'll hurt you a lot less than if you're doing it at 100 kilometres an hour. The amount of force equals your mass and how fast you're driving. That'll tell you how fast you're going to stop, and bang. This was his second law. And the third law is this: if two bodies exert forces on each other, these forces have the same magnitude but opposite directions. Basically, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's Newton's third law. If I'm standing on the table, I'm standing on this stage, I'm exerting a force down, but the stage is exerting a force up on me. That's how it works. Three laws that underpinned the entirety of classical mechanics. Not a bad effort for Isaac Newton. Now, why is this at all relevant to why we're here today? Trust me, hold on, we're going to get there. These laws ultimately described the behaviour of how the world worked, how the world interfaced with the moon. So it led to the understanding of how gravity worked. It led to the understanding of how tides worked. It led to the understanding of how bodies in motion, how pressure worked, how volume worked, how temperature changed things. Much of the scientific world through until the earlier 20th century, much of the Industrial Revolution, much of the development of the Western civilization as we know it, was influenced by these three laws, because once people started to understand how things worked, they could then work out what to do with them. But like everything, people started to use those laws for a whole variety of different reasons that beyond what they were necessarily created for. So one of the challenges of classical mechanics is that it started to compartmentalize everything and pushed a world of determinism, which is for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, then it logically follows that whatever you're doing, there must be a consequence. And in fact, you can't stop what that consequence is going to be because you've already done the action. And it actually started to influence not just the physical sciences, but it started to influence the way people thought about the world from a philosophical perspective. It changed people's perspective around what actually caused the world. It started taking people down the idea that the world is just a giant big machine and we're all cogs in that and we're just moving through that. That sense of identity didn't necessarily have the same value because you were just part of a machine for where there was forces and pressures and temperatures and there was acceleration and momentum and there was all these things working together. And so you had, at the same time as the rapid development of all of the knowledge that came out of the Industrial Revolution and the scientific, and in many ways that it lifted millions of people out of poverty because we had greater food production and all sorts of things. At the same time, it led to some pretty horrendous outcomes in community and pretty horrendous outcomes in society at large, all following from the blind application of these rules and not always thinking about what the consequences of them actually were. Classical mechanics fundamentally changed our entire perception of how the world worked. Changed the relationship between church and state, between church and sciences. It changed the way that countries formed and grew and developed. It moved things and it did things. And classical mechanics said that something was either moving or not moving. And so it was moving, it kept moving. Things were on or off. And classical mechanics kept things in a very binary world described by these equations. And it was a world that was pretty easy to describe for a long period of time. Until a guy called Young came along. Now, in this world of classical mechanics, people have been playing around with light. See, you can see the light. We're just connected to Jesus. See, they knew there was a connection here somewhere, didn't you? During this time of classical mechanics, there was an assumption that light was a particle. And so it would move, and if it started to move, it would continue to move until it hit something, until it bounced off something. And it would behave similarly to all of those rules that we described before. But then a guy called Young did something very, very significant. And it completely upended the entire world. And largely, any of you who are even now able to take your notes on an iPad or iPhone, you can give thanks to this particular image. Now, that is a glorious image. Now, it's actually a modern recreation of the original experiment. So it's actually done with a green laser, which Young didn't have in 1890, whatever it was. But it's a modern recreation of that. Now, this is very exciting. True. So the basic premise of classical mechanics was that if I shone a light through a hole, I should see light on the other side in roughly the shape of the hole. Make sense? We'll get a flashlight, shine it through a hole. So if I have two holes and I have my flashlight, in theory, I should get two lights, or like two circles of light on the other side. And that's what everyone thought would happen. But it turns out it doesn't. When you take two slits, now it's not actually a hole, it's a slit. They're only about, I think in this particular example, it's about 0.4 nanometers wide, so it's very, very, very small. But when you shine a laser through two slits, you don't just get two images of the slit on the paper behind it. You actually get this pattern. And it's very faint over here, but you can see this pattern is repeating and repeating and repeating, then getting brighter, and then it dims down a little bit, then it repeats up again, it comes down. Now, this may not mean much to you, and I'm okay with that. I'm geeking out on a bit, but I've also got the microphone, so I get to, so just hang with me on this. So we'll just go to the next image. So this is actually what was happening. I was loving the fact that I'm getting to do this. So what he did was he had a sodium lamp and he shone it through, and it then goes through 2 slits. And what he discovered was that light was not a particle, it was actually a wave. And the wave then created that pattern. And so for all of these hundreds of years, we'd assumed that light was just a particle and it obeyed those laws of mechanics. But in fact, as soon as we put it through these tiny little holes, we discovered it does something completely different. It's actually a wave. Yeah, Deb Imms. Okay, we'll try this again. You all need to be like phenomenally awed at the significance of this discovery. So, light going through 2 slits is not a particle, it's a wave. Yes. Light is 2 things at once. It's a particle and a wave. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes out of that. I heard someone say, well, it is until you measure it. I'm just loving the fact that I have anyone out here who understands Schrodinger's equations and the uncertainty and probabilistic nature of light and what it actually means, and you can't actually pin down the velocity. And I've got a whole bunch of really great physics jokes that I thought about putting into this, but I really just figure I best not. But there is a point to this. And it's one that, as someone who has had a strong embrace of science and engineering in my life from the earliest days, but has also felt significantly the impact of Christ in my life, I've never found myself uncomfortable about the connection between my faith and science. And in fact, as I've spent time over the years, I've only seen things come more strongly together as you explore what it means. Because when I talk about the idea that light has 2 characteristics, there's a duality to it. It is a particle and a wave, and it behaves differently depending on where you're looking at it and when you're looking at it. And then we talk about the fact that Jesus is the light. Then we start to uncover something else. That there is a dualism to Jesus. That he is more than what we just assume when we look at him. And this is quite actually profound in my mind, that we see in the physical world a manifestation of what we already knew to exist with Jesus. The impact of quantum physics and the impact of that double slit experiment really created quantum physics as we know it today. It underpinned large chunks of all the development of technology through the 20th century. It underpinned our understanding of how nuclear weapons can be made. It's probably not a great outcome, not necessarily something you want in a legacy when you're discovering these things, but it changed fundamentally the world around us. And what was discovered was that the classical laws of mechanics work really well most of the time. So there's nothing wrong with the laws of mechanics. There's no reason we just throw them all out because of quantum physics. But we did discover that there's a limitation to their use. And that when we get into certain areas, when we start looking down certain problems and certain holes, we start to realize that actually quantum physics tells us something else about how the world works, because classical mechanics aren't quite up to the job. As a side note, if you want to look at really, really large things, you start to find the same thing. It's not the quantum physics, you actually find special relativity and the bending of space and time, and that's a whole world of fun that we could have on another Sunday morning. But the point is that classical mechanics has a really strong role to play and still has a role to play, and we still use it in all sorts of work. But it has a limit. And once you need to know when you're beyond that limit because suddenly something else needs to apply. And I think that becomes a really, really powerful metaphor for how we have to think about Christ, salvation, religiosity, what does it mean to be in a church, and to rules and law and all the rest of it. Because we actually start to understand that the very world that has been created by God reflects many of the ways that he wants us to think about things, which shouldn't really be a surprise. We tend to engage with the Bible a bit like Newton's laws. The Bible said X. That's the answer. Well, the Bible said Y. Or we look at someone and we say, well, because of what the Bible said, that person is a sinner, or that person is a failure, or that person is a really good person. We use the Bible like those classical laws to describe and to narrow down our understanding of where different people need to fit and to categorize people. And we use that to then also describe where people are going. Unfortunately, the church has had a long track record of saying, well, someone's a sinner and therefore they'll stay a sinner. That's just the way things are. But we know that that is not what Jesus is actually saying. We know that Jesus says there's something else about the world when we look at it. We know that Jesus said, actually, I see something different in the people around me. Jesus doesn't fit our idea of how things should be. Jesus came along, and when Pharisees were saying, oh, they're tax collectors, they're lepers, you can't talk to them, you need to stay away from them. All bound by rules that they understood and knew and all the rest of it. And what did Jesus do at that point? He sat down with them, ate a meal with them, spent time with them, he healed them, embedded himself in their lives. He said that those rules that had defined the history of the Jewish church for so many years may have been appropriate for a point in time, but they were no longer appropriate for what Jesus was going to do in those individuals' lives. That he'd come forward and said, no, I'm more than a set of rules. I'm actually someone who wants to sit down here and meet with people. When we look to Jesus the light, we find that inherent within him is this duality. That he's both a wave and a particle. That he's two things at once. Mark 14, verse 61 to 63. This is at a point where the Pharisees are challenging him and saying, who are you? What are you doing? Why are you here? But Jesus was silent and made no reply. And then the priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus simply said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, Jesus does something very, very particular here with the words. As he often does, and it infuriates this when my children do this to me, he answers a different question to the one that was actually asked of him. The question was, are you the Son of the Blessed One? And he says, I am. I'm the Son of Man. The Son of Man is not the Son of the Blessed One, yet in fact they are the same thing, but it means two very different things. In the mind of the Pharisees, the Son of God had a very particular meaning. But when he said that I'm the Son of Man, he reinforced that his incarnate nature, the fact that he was actually human, the fact that he was there as someone, he wasn't just some miracle turned up out of nowhere, he was flesh and blood. He was saying something that was rocking the world of the Pharisees at that point, just as much as those light slit things were rocking people's worlds back in 1900s. He was changing their world because he was saying, I am the Son of God and the Son of Man. I am God and man at the same time. The Pharisees had no way of being able to deal with this. Their brain was just not able to compute how all of this came together because they'd been so inculcated, they'd been so ingrained in the idea of there are rules, there are structures, there is hierarchy and order, there is a way of doing these things. And Jesus comes in and says, "No, Son of Man, Son of God, that's me." And he then expressed that by engaging with a whole range of people that the Pharisees thought he had no right, no reason to ever engage with. The duality of Christ mirrors that duality of the light. And it shouldn't be a surprise. It should not be a surprise to us at all that over all of our years of talking about Jesus being the light, that when we go and start looking at light, it behaves a little bit differently to what we expect. And we see in Jesus this duality expressed over and over and over again through his life and his death and his resurrection. Because he upends expectations. The duality of the Son of Man and the Son of God we see visually in the context of the cross, where the Pharisees saw that the Son of God it was a connection to God. It was very vertical. And Jesus said, "No, but I'm here for man and I've got my arms out." And that the role of Christ then is the combination of those two things, not one of them. As I said earlier, it's not the classical mechanics were wrong. And when I thought about why I wanted to present all of this stuff to you before and talk about the science stuff, it's not just because I'm geeking out on it, although it's a little bit of that. But as we prepare for Easter and we roll out all the same traditions that we always have around Easter, and we say the same things that we always do, and we run the same rules around what Easter should look like, we run a significant risk of missing something about who Jesus is and what he actually means to us. The classical mechanics of Newton defined an entire understanding of the world. The Old Testament law for thousands of years defined an entire understanding of how Jews should live in the world that was created for them. It's not that the classical mechanics were wrong, it's that they were only good up to a certain point. It's not that the laws written into the Old Testament were wrong. It's just that they only work up to a certain point. And once you get to that point, you have to find a different way of thinking about it. And Christ provides us that direction to do that. The structures and traditions and rites that the religious amongst us have are not necessarily wrong. As a Pentecostal church, my brother-in-law is an Anglican minister, and I often joke to him about the fact that he's got all the smells and bells. He's actually a relatively modern church, but I like ripping into him about it. But those traditions, the beautiful old churches, the organs, the candles, the music, the incense that is burnt, the prayers that are ordered, the structures that are put in place, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with those things, except to the extent that they become a barrier to a relationship with Jesus. Except to the extent that they become a barrier to our understanding of how we engage with and live with and communicate with Jesus and with Jesus, all the other people that Jesus wants to have a relationship with. The single most significant thing that we need to understand about Jesus is not the question of light and darkness. It's that the light comes with grace. That the light is actually, the light that we receive from him is infused with grace because it is for the least. And for the least of them includes me. That the grace of Jesus is a thing that is actually radically transformational around our understanding of who Jesus is and what he does for us. And Jesus knew this. And Jesus knew what he was actually saying here. And I think, the risk of being heretical, that Jesus had a secret little bit of quantum physics geekery about him. Because we're going to read this verse again. John 8, verse 12. Jesus, the light of the world. Jesus spoke to the people once more and said, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life. At this point in time, we just sort of skip over these words because we hear Jesus talking about, well, it's Jesus saying that I'm the light of the world. Yep, we all get that. It's light and it was dark and I'm here, now there's no dark. But what he actually says is, you will have the light that leads to life. So you will carry the light that I have. Now, the logic out of this is that if we know that Jesus is light and light is dualist, and Jesus has dual elements to him, he's more than just one thing, and that we then have that light, that means that we're more than one thing. Because right there in those worlds, Jesus was saying, here is my grace for you. Whatever label you have had, whatever label I have had in my life, up until that point, I'm going to give you a new label. You can, yes, you'll still have your whole history. All of that will still be true. It'll still be there. But I'm giving you a new label. And you can be more than that. And no one else ever has to say, oh, you are a failure. Oh, you are a sinner. You are bad. Because the dualism of light, the dualism of the grace that I give to you is that I'm saying to you now that you have more than what you had before. You have something different than what you had before. And Jesus can say that because he embedded that, he imbued that. He was light. He was a wave and a particle. He was Son of Man and Son of God. Because when Jesus' light shines on someone, even the most disreputable, even the lepers and the tax collectors, even the people like me who are just engineers, he shines that to us not as someone who is shining light on my sin, but shining a light on me as a son of God, wanting to be relating with me as a son of man who wants to actually bring me into relationship with God. That's what he's doing. And when he brings that light into my life, he's not shining a light on my sin, but he's shining a light on the potential or the relationship that I can have with him into the future. That's the dualism that comes about because of who Christ is. And it's the dualism we have to understand. When we use words like Jesus is the light of the world, we have to understand exactly what the significance of that is, and that significance is mirrored. It is exemplified in the physical realm created by God. It's not something that exists just in church that we talk about. It actually is embedded in our very understanding. The very fabric of our world represents the exact thing that we're saying about Jesus. We are more because of him. We have a new identity because of him. We have a different identity because of him. We are more than whatever we were before. We are more than the world that the religious people said we were. We are more than a label. We're more than a failure. We're more than bad. We are more than the mistake we made. We are more than all of that because of Jesus. We are more than all of that because Jesus, the light, recognizes that he is more than just one thing. He is there as the Son of God, but he is there as the Son of God to be the Son of Man, to be in relationship with us and to bring us into relationship with the Heavenly Father. As the team comes up, I'm going to ask you all to stand, and I'm going to hand over to Janet in a moment because my voice is about to go. But I want us to approach Easter. And I appreciate your patience in putting up with me running through a whole bunch of physics geekery. But I want you to take this home today. Jesus and our understanding of our relationship with him is not something that is separate from the world around us. It's not something that just exists at church or in our connect groups or when we're listening to worship music. The fundamental characteristics of who Jesus is and the grace and the significance of what he is in our life is embedded in our entire world, which means that Easter is all the more significant for us. Because as we prepare for Easter and as we engage with that, we have to be thinking about who is it? Who is it that in our world has got this idea that the church or Christ is just one thing and it's just one thing and it's God saying, well, you're not this or you're not that? Who is it that's got this one idea that church is just religious people with a set of rules? Who is it that is in our lives that needs to know that there is something beyond that? That needs to know that they can have a new label put on their life, and that label on their life comes about because of a man called Jesus. As we go into Easter, my prayer for each of you is that we are able to communicate to all of those people who need to know that new label or know about that new label, that they know three things: that they are made for a relationship with God, they are made to be in a relationship with a family, and that God wants that family to grow. And that, for me, is what Easter is about.